We're super excited today to be meeting with you all and for folks watching the recording later on to be talking about Playwright at Scale. Uh, let's go ahead and just jump into the introductions and then we'll keep moving forward, right? So my name is Jonathan Canales. I'm a senior solutions engineer here at Checkly. Prior to being at Checkly, I was at Cypress as a strategic lead CSM, so working with a lot of really big organizations, helping them figure out how to leverage Cypress at scale. Now that I'm here at Checkly, Checkly is a developer-first synthetic monitoring solution, right? And the idea here is that you're able to use those same Playwright tests that you've already written as synthetic monitors against any environment that you care about, right? So we're solving quite frequently very big at scale problems with Playwright. So that's what brings me here today. I would say, something to note here is if you want to follow me on LinkedIn, feel free to scan the QR code in the lower portion of your screen there somewhere. And then also, a fun fact is I'm one of those people that takes photos of food and I write reviews. So you could say the internet runs because of people like me. Philip?
And people that share cat videos, but you're not one of those, are you?
Not one of those. Not yet.
Maybe I can become one of those. Uh, anyway, my name is Philip. I'm a DevRel at Replay.io, a great company helping you with test flakes. And when I mean helping you with test flakes, I don't mean deleting your tests or muting them or putting them in quarantine, actually fixing them. We record your test in our special browser and then provide you with awesome time traveling dev tools so you can stop at any moment and try to debug what the hell is going on that CI because none of it is happening locally. So if you ever had that frustration, give Replay.io a go. I'm also a longtime Cypress ambassador, probably since the Cypress ambassadorship program started. Not probably, most definitely. And yeah, and a special thing about me, I have 4 children, which many people don't believe, but you might hear them screaming in the background. So if you hear murder noises, that's probably my kids. So that's my introduction. So shall we move on with the webinar?
Absolutely. Uh, yeah. Let's go ahead and keep moving forward. Sorry, you got me laughing. So super quick housekeeping here, right? We have Q&A open. Both Philip and myself, as well as Nika. Nika, again, thank you for kicking us off here and getting us in this space. Ask questions, be kind, be curious. If we're touching on something that you really want us to get back to, throughout the call, we'll absolutely do that. We're gonna have space for Q&A. And this is what our community runs on, right? If there's something that you really want to deeper dive into, we're happy to do that. So with that being said, oh boy, um, definitely have quite an agenda ahead of us for only an hour-long call. We're going to do our best here, right? So without further ado, let's just go ahead and dive into it. But let me first ask Philip a question. Philip, at what point do you start feeling comfortable in a webinar?
At about 10 minutes after it finishes.
Cool.
No, it depends. Like whether the crowd is doing fine. I think they generally are right now, so I'm feeling chill right now. Do you need anything?
No, no, I'm feeling good. I just wanted to gauge when my coffee jitters would probably be over. Cool. Without further ado, let's go ahead and move forward, right? So again, today we're together to talk about Playwright at scale. Um, the idea here is that either you're currently leveraging Playwright, you're thinking about leveraging Playwright, you have bigger problems to solve, right? You belong to an organization or you're trying to think of, hey, how does this going to look for my teams, right? What does this mean for our overall implementation? And I think the main thing that both Philip and I want to start off with is that fundamentals and principles of end-to-end testing and automation stay the same, right? And I think if we could just pick some from here that resonate the most with us before we move forward, I think that would be really helpful. And I think for me, DevOps as a team sport is the one that stands out the most, right? I think in our community, we commonly talk about testing, we commonly talk about QA, and that's traditionally the people that have the titles that are writing the tests, managing the tests, right? Are owning quality. But what we've seen, in the last 5, 6 years with the shift left movement and some of the shift right movement with, monitoring, et cetera, developers, other people throughout the organization are becoming responsible for quality and production. So DevOps as a team sport for me becomes this sort of rallying call where a developer should care about the tests that a QA person is writing or a test engineer is writing, right? An automation engineer definitely cares when flaky tests are so flaky that they're blocking runs. So people being able to understand, hey, how is this automation solution helping us achieve our goals of being an efficient organization is extremely important. Filip, what are your thoughts here? What do you think is probably the most fundamental principle of automation that you'd want to see someone carry forward?
Yeah, as you said, our teams are becoming more interconnected. Uh, Developers delve into testing, testers delve into development, testers and developers both delve into DevOps, right? So we are interconnected. We are collaborating more as a team, and it is really important to make a good choice about our tools. And I can say it out loud, right? There are many people right now that maybe came to this webinar who are really interested in Playwright because it's new, it's interesting, it's fast, it's super shiny. And there are many good reasons to migrate your current Selenium or Cypress test suite to Playwright. There may be some reasons that are not so good. It's really important to evaluate those reasons, because what may end up happening is that you bring your flaky test suite from Selenium and then build a flaky test suite in Playwright, right? So knowing your tools well and knowing what they can and cannot do is going to be really, really important. There's a point number 8, document, which I think is really important. But also, I would like to bring attention to the documentation, right? Because understanding what the tools were built for and what they can and cannot do is going to help you, first of all, drive that decision and make sure that the migration is worthy. But also, it is going to help you understand the intentions behind the tooling, right? Because maybe your business, your product that you're testing, you're working on, maybe it doesn't really match those intentions, and the testing tool is not really a good fit. So again, it's really important to evaluate this, whether you are building from scratch or migrating your tools.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah. So I think, something I really like to do whenever we're on these sorts of calls is throw a curveball, right? Because at the end of the day, kind of you alluded to it. Like if I'm coming from a different solution, if I'm using Selenium or Cypress or really any framework, right? Because no testing or automation solution is inherently flaky, but how we leverage it can create flake. And sometimes, right, these different solutions have their own patterns of adoption. And so what I commonly see with really large organizations taking their first steps into adopting a new platform is I want the exact same tests from this solution, right? Now in this new framework, I want the exact same tests. Is there some sort of migration tool I can use? You
Well, there
can.
might be some.
Exactly. I think sometimes, especially when we talk to folks who are, almost representing a framework as the only solution for testing, et cetera, you can get in this space where it's like, oh, this is just how it's done. But sometimes we can carry along behaviors and practices that we believe are fundamentals that are actually not fundamentals at all.
Yeah.
Filip, any thoughts on this before we move forward?
Yeah, I think one great example to anyone who has written anything in Cypress is page object model. Probably every one of us has read the blog post if you read on Cypress test. that you shouldn't be using page object model in Cypress. And it's not like the page object model in Cypress would be an anti-pattern. It's just that it wasn't the most efficient way to write your tests in Cypress. The same pattern, the same page object model, you can take that to Selenium or maybe even to Playwright, and it is going to work well. It is going to be efficient with you. But I think the more important point to drive is, again, like, what's the tooling that we can use? The argument in Cypress and not using page object model was that you can use so much more. You have the access to the application itself, so you can inject the state of that application if you want to. You can call API requests. You can access Node.js. You can use all the browser data, right? Access cookies, session storage. You can even cache a logged in session. So all of these tools sort of make the page object model, if you are going to be using that for like complex UI interactions, it is going to make it obsolete, right? So again, I'm repeating that for the third time, but knowing the tool and what it can and allows you to do and how it was built is going to help you understand what the patterns that you should be using are, and what are the anti-patterns for this particular tool, because you can have a best practice in one tool which is going to be an anti-pattern in the other tool.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so I think even looking at this, right, it is important to understand what types of tests are supported by Playwright out of the box. You have what you would expect, E2E integration, but you also have tests like API. Component testing is experimental right now. You have visual regression out of the box, right? You can do performance testing, you can do accessibility testing. Now, as someone just exploring this and thinking about adopting it for your organization, you don't need to start, writing API tests out of the box. But I think it's important to really get an idea of, hey, what can this framework do for our organization? Who else can I bring into this conversation to really assess whether or not this solution makes sense? And what should I be aware of, right? Filip, what are your thoughts here around these supported testing types? Did anything kind of catch you off guard here?
Didn't really caught me off guard. I think it also highlights the point we made earlier, right? About testing not being only domain of a certain group in the organization, but we have developers, testers, test automation engineers, we have DevOps people now all being considered with testing and maybe even writing the test code itself. So again, the tooling is going to be important, but also what eventually is going to bring a tool into a company is the end-to-end testing, right? So all of the other areas where Playwright can be used and where it is going to be scaled up are a great advantage, right? Because as you start with sort of this entry gate of end-to-end tests, you can start thinking about what are the other ways of implementing the test tool and how we can utilize it to do some more API testing, visual regression, check our accessibility, performance, etc. I would also note that when you have, it often happens in companies that sometimes a team member needs to move from one team to another. If you have multiple people, multiple different teams using different tools, it's going to make that transition much harder. And this is sort of an organizational aspect we don't really think about, but when we are talking about testing solutions at scale, not only the test suite is scaling, but I imagine the company might be scaling as well, right? So you might be having people moving around, and having a familiar tool being used in all of the different departments of the company is going to make that migration for the team member much easier, because that team member, if they're moving from one team to another, they're going to have a lot of work just like getting themselves familiar with the code base and creating a first pull request or setting up stuff locally. but also if they have the initial additional hurdle of learning a new tool, that's going to add like an uh, extra problem sent their way. So that's also one thing where this kind of diversity of testing areas is going to be a great advantage.
Yeah. So I think, just to call this out one last time here, right? When we're thinking about who's owning a framework, again, working at Checkly, synthetic monitoring platform, I'm seeing SREs who have never touched JavaScript ever, right? Writing Playwright tests for very complex API checks that are already, running in production, right? And they're getting immense value out of it. All of a sudden, looking at frameworks in this very holistic way becomes extremely important for the sort of value that your company can get from, being able to leverage a new tool that does cover different testing types, right?
Yep.
So I think I really love this one, right? Isolation, test isolation and parallelism in Playwright is extremely important for your organization or for you to know about as you start leveraging the tool, as you think about, again, Playwright at scale, right? The idea here is that instead of specs being fully parallel, well, they're all running at the same time, your tests are also fully parallel, right? And so being able to be intentional about how these two things come together becomes extremely important. I'm going to switch to the next slide, and then Filip, I'd love your take on this real fast.
Yeah, so parallelization is one of those areas where thinking about it from day one is going to be really valuable. Like when we talk about abstractions and page object models and optimizations of code, there are lots of blog posts, lots of ideas and opinions on how it should be done. I think the most sober opinion that I have heard is that don't try to make your application or your test into something that it is not today, right? The premature optimization, trying to uh, write dry code, do not repeat yourself, right? From day one, that's actually not that useful, I would argue. At least not on the day one where you have zero tests and you need to write some more. But there are some practices which I would argue are really good to think about from day one. And I think parallelization is going to be one of them. And the reason for this is that as your test suite grows and as you have more and more tests, the need for parallelization is going to grow. And as it grows, you are going to make that decision. All right, now we have to run them in parallel, maybe shard them into multiple machines so that they can each run individually. If you have 200 tests at that point and they are not optimized to run in parallel because they interfere with one another for some reason, because you're using the same account for all the tests, or you're, I don't know, checking out a checkout card and you're doing parallel checking out, or I don't know what kind of example I would give here. If that's something that's going to happen to you, well, guess what? Now you have 200 tests that you need to rewrite, right? You wanted to make them faster, and instead you get a 4-week tech debt that you need to take care of. So yeah, think about parallelization from day one. And I have to give shout out to Playwright here, right? They kind of force you to think about it from day one, because you're going to cover this, but there are different levels of parallelization, and by default you have the fully parallel option set to true, which means Playwright will take a look into your spec and actually pick tests one by one and run them in parallel. So if your tests start failing for whatever reason when you run them in parallel, this might be the reason that they're sort of interfering with one another. So if that's your first spec, you're in luck. You're just going to rewrite one spec instead of those 200.
Absolutely. What I really love is like this idea of understanding where you should be optimizing at the very beginning, right? Again, thinking about this from a holistic DevOps standpoint, uh, it's not just test engineers that need to understand these tests, and they don't just run and perform for that group of people anymore, right? Developers are going to be blocked by a flaky implementation, because if they're essentially writing their specs and they're practicing full parallelism, but some other group isn't, and we all share responsibility for those tests, like Filip is saying, you're going to start encountering a pretty heavy refactor, right? And I think when we were talking earlier about best practices and fundamentals, test isolation is a fundamental. It's something that, even Cypress started adopting, I believe, in Cypress 12, if I'm not mistaken, right, where they implemented it. And it was a shock to people, right? And the reason why I think it's worth calling this out is because I still encounter, even, working with folks that are fully intent on adopting Playwright, I still encounter people that want their specs to run in a certain order, right? They want their tests within those specs to run in a certain order. And that's possible, but it's extremely important to understand that this is an anti-pattern, right?
Yeah.
And is it an anti-pattern because of, just testing? Sure, right? We could look at it that way. We could look at it like, hey, all these things are interacting. They shouldn't be. When something fails, you're not going to know why it failed. Great. But you can also look at it as an anti-pattern, because when you're running not in full parallel like this, you're actually doing some pretty significant harm to the time it takes for your test to run. And over time, this test suite not running in as optimized of a fashion as it can be is going to be 100 hours, 1,000 hours of developer time waiting for things to run, or dealing with flake, or having to refactor tests because we didn't take this into account to begin with in our initial adoption. So Playwright at scale, you're leveraging full parallelism. This is a superpower. This is something you should lean into. Any closing thoughts here before we move forward, Filip?
Yeah, I think this might be one of those cases where running your tests sequentially, depending on one another, is an anti-pattern in no matter which tool you use, right? If not for anything else, then because of the observability of your tests, right? If you have 5 tests in your spec or whatever, and the first test will run, you will never know if the rest of your functionalities work as well, right? So you can imagine you have an online form that has 5 pages, right? If you want to run an end-to-end test and it will fail on the first page, you don't know if the bug, well, there's definitely some problem on the first page, but what about all those other 4 pages, right? Do you know if they're working or not? And if they're not, like when will you discover, right? Because you may fix your test, make sure it doesn't fail, and then you find another bug on page 2, and then on page 3, 4, 5, and that's going to make your release cycle or fix cycle so much longer than that it's going to be a nightmare. So yeah, again, another point for making sure your tests run in parallel is going to take shorter time for you to fix any issues.
Absolutely. Okay, cool. Let's keep moving forward here. And I think, AJ brought up this really great point, right? While you're explaining that. And they said, however, Gherkin syntax is based on not parallel running sequentially, right? And this is awesome. And I think anytime I'm on a webinar, I'm always showing the same tired graphic. Like I will always show this, right? Because to me, really thinking about who owns automation, right? If we are writing our tests for product managers who are not technical, or some end business case user who is not technical to be able to step through our tests, to me, and again, just thinking about this at scale, that's not very scalable. Yes, you can implement Gherkin, Cucumber, BDD makes sense. I totally understand that. But just like with maybe some of the page object model sort of approach, which Playwright fully supports, how necessary is it now, right? when we look at our tests and we look at how we write them and the syntax that they're using, the only way, one of the few ways that we can kind of get stuck here is if we start writing tests with the assumption that it's just for us or it's just for this one group of people. If we start implementing a solution like Cucumber and there's a layer of abstraction on top of the tests that we're writing, and then something fails and that same test is actually doing synthetic monitoring, right? You're going to find someone at 3 a.m. very confused about what they should be looking at, right? That's not to say it's not practical. I think at the end of the day, we are also having this conversation around scale being about what's practical, right? If there is some hard requirement for using Cucumber for BDD for, again, these non-technical users, et cetera, absolutely do that. Just make sure that that justification warrants cutting off everyone else from the organization, being able to look at your tests, clearly and easily. Philip, any questions or thoughts here before we cover what's on the screen?
Yeah, I may be a little bit more harsh. I'm not the biggest fan of the Gherkin syntax, and for me, it's more about the practicality, right? Anytime you want to create a new step, that step needs to get abstracted to its own module, right? So I think the number one argument for the Gherkin syntax is that, oh, anyone can write the test automation now because we have these different modules. But I wouldn't say that's necessarily true, because what you are creating is this Lego blocks that you can just sort of hash around and play with in different orders. But if you want to create anything new, then you still need to get a technical person writing that block for you. And it also begs the question, how efficient is that test suite if it's just a combination of different blocks, and whether you are not repeating yourself in the execution, right? So I mentioned do not repeat yourself in the code, but for some reason we are not so much concerned about the test execution repeated all the time. uh, we are at a webinar, Playwright at Scale, right? So as you start scaling, you are going to get concerned about the tests run and how long does it take, right? So what that means is that your tests not only need to test everything that's needed for the customer and make sure that the risk is mitigated, it's also going to mean that your test should run in a optimal way. And what I see as with Gherkin is that it repeats the same patterns just in like a different combination over and over again. And that means that if you are at scale, if you have maybe thousands of tests already, a lot of those patterns are going to get repeated. And maybe some patterns are not, or some areas are not covered at all, because they're waiting for the developer to create that block for you. Uh, so again, as Jonathan said, if there's a trade-off that's being made and it is worth it, then by all means, don't listen to me. Go for it. You know better than I do about your code base, right? So take my rant here with a grain of salt. Um, but the thing I wanted to point out is the practicality, and that is where I think the Gherkin syntax sort of lacks.
Yeah, I think this is great. And honestly, what a wonderful conversation, because it fits with this slide perfectly, right? We think about DevOps as a holistic practice that we're all involved in. On the right-hand side, we have use cases for Playwright and automation, right? And essentially what I left off here, what I could have included is, in the product release cycle, PMs being able to validate that, hey, this feature does what it needs to do, and now we can deploy it, right? I think this is definitely something worth mentioning. But again, I just want to call out, like, if we look at all these other use cases and we optimize for only one part of the, of DevOps here, how are we impacting the rest of our cycle, right? How can I say this? Being at Checkly, working with primarily very technical teams, right? And obviously, like, everyone at Checkly, like, this is everyone here is like at some next level. It's the same thing at replay, right? Everyone's super everyone's firing off at a level that I think is unmatched in the industry to a degree. And I'm not blowing smoke here. And the reason why I'm saying this is because sometimes when we're working with super technical teams, I can myself get lost on the idea that, hey, maybe there are PMs that don't know JavaScript. Maybe there are PMs that, don't know Playwright, can't pick up an automation solution easily. And there is some real significant value here for implementing Cucumber and Gherkin for them, right? I don't really see a lot of those teams. I think what I've seen in the industry is a real strong push for everyone to be technical, right? Especially with Playwright at scale or some solution at scale. There's no time or space for someone not to be able to understand how JavaScript works to some degree, right? I hate to paint such a broad picture there, but that's what we're seeing here, and I think this is what this image is trying to get to. You're using Playwright as an automation solution across DevOps for your PMs, for your engineers, etc. Filip, anything else to close out on before we
Uh,
move?
no, not really. Just wanted to give shout out to AJ or Aj. I'm not sure how to pronounce your name, but feel free to post more questions into the chat. So far, it's been slightly quiet. I guess that's because you're all listening. Uh, but yeah, feel free to post your questions, and we'll get to them. AJ, all right, thank you. And we'll get to them either at the end or during, as we did right now.
Great. I mean, great question. I love when people bring up Cucumber. Also, it's worth noting that whenever I've seen Cucumber implemented, it normally adds around 15 to 10% in overall execution time for your tests because they have to do the transpilation. Yeah. So that's fun. Just wanted to note that. Uh, cool. So I think, what we've been able to walk through so far is Playwright hits all of these really different and sort of united feature sets, right? That an entire organization can gain a lot from. And so some questions that are literally coming into the chat right now, I think are perfect for the slide, right? Like, hey, what about Cucumber? It executes this way. Hey, what about the page object model, et cetera? Like, what do I do here to not spend time on the wrong thing early on? And I think thinking about what sort of adoption and migration plan there is for you, right? If you're a solo dev and maybe you're part of a larger organization and you're like, Playwright seems like the bet, I really want to start exploring, I wouldn't even focus on page object model out of the gate. I would focus on, let's use code gen, let's leverage some community resources like Filip, myself, the Playwright Discord, etc., and see, hey, does this do what I want it to do, right? For my test cases today, whatever the most complex one is, and whatever the most painful one is, can Playwright handle that? I would almost start with that first and then go from there, right? Because if the most painful thing you want to accomplish with the solution just isn't possible, and it's a non-starter for your team or even yourself to move forward, solve that first before over-optimizing in something else. Filip, what are your thoughts around how organizations can adopt and migrate effectively?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think like 2 weeks ago we were doing a live stream on Playwright surpassing Cypress at weekly downloads, and I think this speaks very well to the size of the community which is now behind Playwright. I remember like 5 or 6 years ago when Cypress was just starting, that was, and I started very early. I started with version 0.20 or something like that, so I was a very early adopter in Cypress. But I remember that I'm kind of alone here. I don't know who else, like if I have this problem, I don't know how to solve it. And eventually I had to solve most of the problems myself before the community started growing, uh, which helps. But on the other side, having a community around you, people solving different problems, people using different implementations, is going to help. So that community resource is going to help a lot. In fact, if you are thinking about using Playwright, you can just join Playwright's Discord channel. I believe we'll have a link somewhere. Yeah, we'll have it at the end. Join the Playwright's Discord channel, because they have, every week they do a happy hour, or every other week, I don't remember. They do a happy hour, sort of a live stream, letting you know what they're up to, what's new, giving various tips. Just past Thursday, they had a happy hour on the new clock API that they have released with the latest version. And this has inspired me to create my first Playwright video. So if you want to watch for that, you can go ahead and check it out. I am a Cypress ambassador, but I have my first Playwright video out already, so that's new. Let me show you the link. Uh, Also about the code gen, I think that's a great point, right? Code gen is a great tool. What I think it is a learning tool. It is called code gen, right? Like it would generate ready to go code that you can just run. Usually, if you run it the second time, it's going to to fail. So don't believe anyone who claims that you're going to write all of your tests in half a day. That's just not going to happen, right? But what it is good for, I think it's still very, very valuable tool, because it is going to show you how your interactions on page and how your assertions are going to look like in the Playwright code. So at the end of the day, it's an educational tool. And it's a very important educational tool, because if you're not familiar with Playwright's syntax, if you are maybe not even familiar with test automation, you get amazing amount of insight using this tool. So I just wanted to give a shout out to that as well.
Absolutely. And I would say, again, thinking about this Playwright at scale, right? If I really think about how I see organizations sort of choosing to adopt this solution, it's through pilot evaluations, right? Where essentially a team of engineers, SREs, test engineers, QA, right? Whatever identified stakeholders there are that are impacted by tests, by end-to-end tests, right? Essentially are brought together and they work through a solution, right? They spend a sprint or some time figuring out, hey, is this new solution what we want to move forward with? And they come up with a recommendation. I'm sure a lot of folks out there have seen these recommendations come in where it says, hey, this solution's in, this solution's out. Here's why, and here's when you need to migrate, right? I think that sort of approach is great, because what you want to do, again, is democratize the use of solutions. That way your entire org can benefit versus just one team, right? So if you're an engineering manager, a director, a leader in engineering of some kind, and you're thinking about Playwright, or you're actively wanting to adopt Playwright, don't put the burden on yourself, right? Like, let's let other people in the organization figure out what benefits the solution has for them and whether or not it's something they can leverage. Anything
Yeah.
else we can move forward with?
Yeah, I think the next question that came in actually plays really well into the next slide. Kevin is wondering how you face with production environment. Uh, every step forwards on test automation could be a security problem. But let's talk about check lead and how to solve that.
Yeah, I think this is a great question, right? So before we get into that, I think it's important again to look at this as Playwright's an automation solution. You can do it for a ton of different things, right? Web scraping, load testing, security testing. You can use it with customer reporters, test management, etc. And of course, I saved the best for last for synthetic monitoring. The idea here is that those same tests that you've written, that lead all the way to production, but don't go over to production, you're all of a sudden able to reuse those tests against live environments, right? When you're leveraging Heroku or Vercel, right, your organization's already depending on preview deployments So that way you can continue to interact with your application even when it's not under test. So all synthetic monitoring is doing is taking that to the very next logical step and saying, hey, why stop at production? These are the tests you care about. Let's go ahead and run them. And I think Kevin, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. I think Kevin, this is a great question, right? What are the security concerns? What does it mean to test in production, right? These are the sorts of things that you have to figure out. You have to use things like client certificates. You have to use things like IP address whitelisting, right? You have to do things like, hey, I know that when I'm doing synthetic monitoring, Checkly's using a particular agent. Let me greenlight that agent to run against my services without flagging it, right? There are so many different permutations for what synthetic monitoring means or testing in production means, that it's something bespoke. And that's why, again, this is like an advanced use case that we're seeing a lot of traction with from some really large organizations with over 1 billion, social media users and things like that. And I think it's an important one because as we talk about Playwright at scale, these other advanced use cases really come to the forefront. Philip, any thoughts or questions here before we move on to Flake?
Yeah, I think what Checkly does really speaks to the fact of why do we even write tests, right? If we are using continuous integration to make sure that our tests run and pull requests do not get merged until all of the tests passes, that's all great, right? But our users are not using our staging environment, or they don't use our pull request branches or whatever. They're using production. So you can implement all kinds of checks, whether that's on the code level, on the pipeline level, but ultimately what's going to matter is the user experience. If that's broken, then nothing else really matters, right? And you can fix your pipeline, you can fix your DevOps, you can fix anything, you can do a post-mortem, but if your production is down, then unfortunately you're going to lose money, you're going to lose trust in your customers. So implementing something like Checkly for doing a monitoring that's actually advanced, not just like pinging if the production is online, right? But actually going through a flow, implementing your end-to-end tests that a real user would do, but running that against production just to make sure that everything is still running even after deployment. That is great. That is something you should be aware of because, again, none of your tests really matter. What ultimately matters is the product, the life that is out there for your users to be used. So yeah, kudos to Checkly.
Yeah, I think the one last thing I want to touch on here, right, is that, and this is just a nice little Easter egg. The code that you're looking at on the screen is for an alert channel where, hey, a team or a committer is pushing to production or to some environment that we care about. Okay, great. Let's say they push some code and everything starts breaking. What typically happens is people will look for like a git blame and see who did what last, and there's quite a bit of pouring over to do. But what you see here is that through a GitHub action, essentially, I'm passing in a committer environment variable when I'm creating this alert. And so in that, what we're doing is we're naming the last known committer, right? Who who may have broken the check, who may have broken a test in production, or may have broken the application itself. So being able to get an alert that says like, hey, this person broke a thing, all of a sudden becomes really, really important, right? Um,
Implement, connect that with PagerDuty and you're golden.
exactly. And so I think, here we are talking about how Playwright at scale can handle Flake. I think some of my favorite commands here are on the left, and that's waiting for a request, wait for events, right? You shouldn't be waiting for a timeout. You don't have to do hard waits anymore. Wait for an element to show up on the screen. Wait for a request to resolve. Soft assertions, I think, is also extremely powerful. When I'm initially writing some tests, I don't want to immediately fail ever, right? I want to see all the errors and everything that could possibly go wrong, because when I have the rest of that context, It really helps me figure out like, hey, where should I get started? What actually went wrong, right? To pass is really nice because essentially you can retry blocks of code without retrying the entire test, right? And polling is also really great because essentially you're saying, hey, I'm just checking to see if some state has been updated over a set period of time versus just waiting, right? And why this is important is because flake is everyone's biggest enemy, right? From QA test engineers to developers to ops people running Playwright for synthetic monitoring. The fact that something can both fail and pass, it will make you crazy, right? And the last thing you want to get is an alert at 3 a.m. for something that you can't resolve on your own, or it might just be some weird intermittent issue or an non-deterministic test. So these sorts of approaches help you reduce the amount of flake you may be encountering, right? And I think there's something on the right here, Philip, that maybe you wanna speak to that can also help address flake as well.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So that's a screenshot of replay. And I just want to point out that there may be some of you in the viewing this, looking at the different commands, and you might get a feeling like there are some sort of anti-patterns, right? That you shouldn't retry your tests. If your test is failing, it should definitely fail. You shouldn't be polling or doing all that kind of jazz around your test. But the reality, if we're being pragmatic, is that as you scale number of your tests, all of your tests are now going to become a code that you need to maintain, right? So as the number of tests go up, your maintenance cost is going to up, and especially the time you're going to be spending on that maintenance is going to go up. You need more people, more time. It's going to make your head explode, right? And that's where Replay comes in. So Replay is a browser that records everything that's happening inside it, and you can use it as a drop-in replacement for your Chrome browser, for your Playwright test automation or your Cypress test automation. And it's basically no different than the Chrome or Chromium that you're using for your tests. The only difference is that it records everything that is happening, including your application code and your test code. So why would that be useful? Well, have you ever had the problem of you ran something on CI and it failed? Your flaky tests, you have a flaky test that's only happening on CI and not locally. Well, Replay is like your dev tools for your CI. You can actually bring back whatever happened on CI and look into what is going on. And you might think, all right, well, Trace Viewer does this, right? And you'd be sort of right. Trace Viewer does collect a lot of information about the test, but is leaving out the application that's being under tests, right? So that's where Replay comes in, because not only it records sort of like a video from your test execution, it will record every line of your code, line by line, so you can examine what was happening with your code, how many times that line of code was called out. You can console log out information about the different values. And what's all that useful for? Well, for your flaky tests. Because when you run your test, you can get to any race condition that happened. If you clicked on a button too early, typed into an input field too early, any kind of flake that's happening either in Cypress, Playwright, or even Selenium, you can get to. So if I can plug anything today, as I just did, I'm going to say go ahead and try Replay. Especially if you're scaling up, you have more and more tests, more and more become flaky, and you don't really know what's happening. If you're working for a company that's actually bound by SLA, or you have like MTTR, mean time to repair your feature or your test, that's going to be golden for you. So yeah, flaky tests.
Heard. Yeah, I think the biggest thing to kind of double click on here, right, is that when you're leveraging a solution at scale, there are going to be additional services and things like that that you can absolutely adopt that will make your life easier. flake is going to happen. Flake is going to be significant. You're going to have to figure out what to do there. Replay is a really great solution for that. Again, thinking about Playwright at scale and looking at DevOps as a practice everyone practices. Is synthetic monitoring something that makes sense to implement? The answer is absolutely yes, right? You could do this with vanilla Playwright. It'd probably be pretty painful. But as we kind of wind down the end of this webinar here with some like really great timing, actually, I was afraid we were going to go over. What I'd like to leave you all with are resources and to also follow up on some things, right? So Checkly has a YouTube channel that does weekly Playwright tips with Stefan. It's awesome. He's always doing a new Playwright tip video. He's one out of the 10 Playwright ambassadors in the world. Also, 2 out of the 10 Playwright ambassadors in the world actually work here at Checkly. The Playwright Discord is awesome, right? Debbie O'Brien runs a really great community there. There are constant events, constant helping in the community. It is actually really great to see. They'll also do like a live stage every week, which is great. And then what you see to the left here is the Checkly community Slack. So because we're a Playwright shop underneath the hood, we talk about Playwright all the time. Again, myself, a lot of other really talented folks, our founders, etc., are in this community Slack channel every day, answering the sorts of questions that you all have asked here that we probably don't have time to address in this webinar. And I'd like to just say on the left, again, we'll also try to make these slides available so you can have access to all these resources and some of the what some would term as dank memes that I created during this webinar. You'll be able to access, right? Again, those same resources, Microsoft Learn Playwright. One of my favorite resources that I think is an unsung hero, this UItestingplayground.com. It's such a great place for you to start using an automation solution and just see how it behaves. Philip, are there any resources that I missed here?
Yeah, I've just sent a link to Replay.io homepage to the chat. But also, you know what? If you are interested in checking out Replay, feel free to either tag me on LinkedIn or reach out to me. Or if you want a demo of Replay, I'm just sending my Cal link. Feel free to book a meeting if you feel like this is something you want to see or you want to try. I'm here to help you out. So again, if you're battling with flaky tests or you're scaling up, I think it might be worth checking it out. But yeah, you'll see for yourself.